Good evening, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, sorry, this is a stupid fucking bit. Nosferatu is a masterpiece of modern horror. It's a bold call to make, barely a few months after its theatrical release, but there's not a doubt in my mind that in the years to come, we'll look back on 2024's Nosferatu as a major milestone in the genre. Last year was when I really decided to rededicate myself to horror movies. I watched 33 of them in October alone, and there were more than enough sprinkled throughout the rest of the year. My viewing schedule was full of new releases, timeless classics, and random movies I had never heard of that popped up on one streaming service or another. One of the biggest pleasures of my extended horror education was that I really got to dive into the filmography of Robert Eggers. I was previously only familiar with The Northman, which I adore, but now that I've been able to experience The Vivitch and The Lighthouse, I've gotten fully on board with whatever he wants to throw at me. Robert Eggers is best known for two things: tense horror, taking place in historically accurate settings, and having a career with absolutely no misses. These are tough expectations to carry into your fourth movie, but Eggers and the production team beside him kept that outstanding streak going with Nosferatu. I wrote the first draft of this introduction months ago, but post-Oscars, with Nosferatu having gotten a number of nominations, though no wins tragically, it's clear that I'm not the only person in love with this movie. So, I'm going to talk about it. In this absolutely spoiler-filled video, fair warning, I want to explain why I loved Nosferatu so much as a fan of horror, Robert Eggers, and all vampire media. It's not coincidental that my year of horror movies was the same year I got really into vampire stuff. It started with finally reading Bram Stoker's Dracula for the first time, and that obsession spiraled into reading everything I could get my hands on. For the record, my favorites were Carmilla and A Long Time Dead, if you're looking for reading recommendations from a YouTube channel, but the most fun I've gotten out of vampires so far is running a version of Curse of Strahd set in Victorian London. So, I love horror movies, I love vampires, and of course, I love Nosferatu. There are so many standout elements that come together to make Nosferatu as effective as it is, and trying to string them together into a single coherent paragraph would be a fool's errand on par with trying to bait Count Orlok by setting a crypt on fire. So, as I like to do, I've broken this video down into sections. From the limited online discourse I'm exposed to now that I'm blissfully free of Twitter, I get the impression that the most common point of discussion about Nosferatu is how sensual it is. I'm not sure I'm supposed to say this word because people I know in real life watch my YouTube videos, so I'll stick with sensual. It's a fair thing for people to notice. The sexual nature of vampiric possession is front and center throughout the entire movie, from the very opening shot. The comparison between a vampire's bite and seduction is pretty obvious, and has been an overt metaphor since the vampire genre first gained prominence. As I mentioned, I read Dracula for the first time this year, and the sensuality is practically as much a part of the story as the ink it's printed with. This energy is something that's made it into a lot of Dracula's adaptations, most notably when Sir Christopher Lee started portraying the Count in Hammer horror films in the 50s and 60s. As Empire put it when putting Lee's Count Dracula at number 7 on a list of the 100 greatest horror characters of all time, Lee also understood, crucially, that an important layer from Bram Stoker's novel had been missing from Lugosi's performance: sexuality. Since the original Nosferatu was an unauthorized, slightly changed German language adaptation of the Bram Stoker novel, it makes perfect sense that its remake would have these same sexual themes. But boy oh boy, do Robert Eggers and friends bring that to a whole new level. Ellen's nightmares cause her to moan aggressively in every other scene of this movie. Count Orlok essentially mounts his victims to drink their blood, and the titular villain is literally killed when Ellen has sex with him until the sun comes up. Not to mention the various instances of nudity sprinkled throughout. Seriously, there is a lot of nudity sprinkled throughout this movie. Notably, the sensual representation of vampire bites and nudity aren't limited to the female characters, which is something that can also be traced back to the original Dracula. Much has been made of the potential queer undertones to be found in Dracula, and I'll link an interesting Medium article by Jonathan Paletti that explores how these themes could relate to Bram Stoker's own enigmatic sexuality. Depictions of queerness, featuring both men and women, can be traced back to the very beginning of the modern vampire genre. Dracula and its predecessor, Carmilla, both feature intensely homoerotic content, and that makes up a fundamental piece of the vampire genre's DNA. All of this to say, it would feel weird and exploitative if all the times vampirism was framed in a sensual manner was when it victimized women, but in the novel, as in 2024's Nosferatu, that isn't the case. Men are just as big a part of the non-stop sexual energy of this movie as women, and I really gotta hand it to Robert Eggers for that one. So yes, this movie is incredibly horny and wears that proudly on its sleeve. Aside from making weird, lame people uncomfortable though, it's an incredibly important part of vampires in literature that Nosferatu absolutely had to capture, and it did so with flying colors. But whose job was it to get that sensuality across on screen? Obviously, that job falls to the cast. Nosferatu features a stable of so many talented actors that it honestly feels unfair, and the biggest surprise for me was Lily Rose Depp. I knew practically nothing about her prior to Nosferatu, other than that she was in a show I didn't watch, but that was apparently not good, so I didn't know what to expect. Ellen Hutter is the foundation on which the entire movie is built, and Depp shoulders that immense responsibility with a lot of grace. First of all, her English accent was remarkably solid, if unnecessary given that the movie takes place in Germany, and having recently watched Keanu's attempt at playing an English character in a vampire movie, the difference is night and day. Depp also absolutely sells the hell out of the nightmare scenes, and she can be genuinely terrifying in her own right when the scene demands it. The physical acting on display in some of the scenes is unsettling to the point of horror, and if she had committed to it any less, it would have looked ridiculous. Praising Willem Dafoe for being brilliant and scene-stealing feels redundant at this point, but I would be remiss if I didn't give him a shout-out for the unhinged energy he brings to every single one of his scenes. I've always been a big fan of Nicholas Hoult, going back to Warm Bodies and more recently The Menu, and his wide-eyed innocence as Thomas Hutter serves as the perfect foil to Count Orlok's villainous seduction. Aaron Taylor-Johnson is a particular highlight in the supporting cast for me. He and Emma Corrin work very well together, and he manages to bring a lot of life to a character that could potentially be a one-note rich asshole. While the character is, in fact, a rich asshole, the audience is made to feel through his performance how much, if nothing else, he truly loves his wife and family, and how distraught he is about their deaths. The acting across the board is phenomenal, something that of course has to go along with praise of Robert Eggers' directing. His ability to get these performances out of his cast while maintaining the tension and unsettling atmosphere of historical horror is nothing short of heroic, and he's clearly able to get the casts of all of his movies to buy into his vision, which is why he has so many repeat performers from movie to movie. Eggers is legendary for sweating the details when it comes to the historical accuracy of clothes, sets, and dialects, and when a cast sees that, they can tell the director is dedicated to making the best possible movie from the source material. That kind of energy is infectious and drives the quality of the entire project, and Eggers deserves all the praise in the world for fostering that environment on his sets. It shows in the finished product. If you've ever seen a single shot of any Robert Eggers movie, then I don't need to tell you that Nosferatu is absolutely gorgeous. Every frame is dripping with character, whether or not a character actually appears in it. From the idyllic streets of Visborg to Orlok's decrepit Carpathian castle, every location is a work of art in itself, a holdover from the director's days as a production designer. And the way the characters are framed in these spaces goes so far to establishing and maintaining tension. It was never going to win, given the deserved momentum behind The Brutalist, but Nosferatu is full value for its cinematography nomination. Jarn Blaschke has shot all of Robert Eggers' films, and he's a key piece of what makes them so special. His work on The Lighthouse, also nominated for an Oscar, is iconic, and the look of that movie is what really sells it, even more than Pattinson and Dafoe. He carries over that brilliant eye for a shot to Nosferatu, giving it the striking look that draws us into the world of Orlok and Ellen. It's not just the cinematography either. Of course, the person behind the camera is responsible for capturing everything, but there has to be something worthwhile in front of it to film. That's why I have to thank the sweet mercy of the gods above for the brilliant costuming and production design, both of which were also nominated for Oscars. The costume designer, Lyndon Muir, is another frequent Eggers collaborator, and given his obsession with historical accuracy, she's always had a lot of work to do. Every single character has a distinct style of dress that captures their essence, from the buttoned-up Thomas and the perpetually black-clad Ellen to the ancient, rotting noble dress of the Count. Despite their clearly defined individual styles, each of these costumes feels like part of a cohesive world, which draws you into the story and makes you feel as much a part of it as any of the characters. We all instinctively see Dracula, and vampires as a whole, as being associated with a long-gone era of fashion, and Muir captures that perfectly. The production design work done by Craig Lothrop and Beatrice Brent-Nerova matches the insane bar set by the costuming. I just can't get over the way this movie looks. The castle, the homes, Willem Dafoe's stoner shack. It all feels so real and lived in and alive, in a way that once again draws you into the movie. It's not a painting, so calling Nosferatu beautiful almost seems like a slight to all of the non-visual elements that make it so special. But goddamn, it's just so nice to look at that I can't help it. Nosferatu is one of the most gorgeously put together movies I've ever seen. It's all well and good to be beautiful and well acted and sensual, but at the end of the day, any adaptation of Dracula has to be a horror movie. So, is Nosferatu a good horror movie? I mean, yeah, obviously. Robert Eggers is the modern master of gothic horror, and he pulled out all the stops to make this as tense and terrifying as possible, especially if you were fortunate enough to see this in a theater. The horror of Nosferatu is all-encompassing. The biggest threat hanging over the movie is the knowledge that Orlok is inextricably linked to Ellen. No matter what the characters try to free her from his grasp, nothing seems to work, and the entire world around them is becoming infected as a result of his bond with her. The sense of inevitability is terrifying. And as we watch Visborg succumb to plague and side characters die at an alarming rate, we know that Orlok is drawing closer and closer. Ellen's inability to free herself of Orlok, despite her best efforts, is another kind of horror, that being the repression of freedom of choice, particularly for women, in both historical and modern society. Ellen repeatedly makes clear that she wants nothing to do with Orlok, but through his dark magic, she is stripped of all of her agency. Nothing is more terrifying than the thought that what we want doesn't matter, that bad things will happen to us regardless of how hard we fight. There's also the terror of being alone in a strange land, at the mercy of strangers that you don't understand. Maybe this is the social anxiety talking, but there's a distinct horror to being someone's guest, knowing that something is wrong, but that saying anything would be rude. Thomas wants nothing more than to go home to his wife, but through the trappings of social pressure, he's forced to imprison himself in this nightmare castle. When we're trapped in social situations we can't get out of, it's usually not because of vampire magic, but we understand that horror on a gut level. Nosferatu isn't afraid to use traditional elements of horror movies either. Several effective jump scares that just about made me piss myself are peppered throughout the movie, and the terrifying and brilliant makeup effects add a lot to the evil appearance of Count Orlok. I mean, shit, it's a horror movie and it scared me. What more could I possibly ask for? I don't know if I have a lot of Hollywood bigwigs in my audience, but if I do, I've got a couple favors to ask. 1, continue giving Robert Eggers and the people who work with him lots of money to make more movies like this. And 2, please make more sensual vampire movies. It's what this country needs to get back on track. I should probably be summarizing everything I've said into some sort of coherent conclusion, but mostly Nosferatu left me in a state of awe. I've done my best to explain why I loved it so much, but honestly, you should just go watch it if you haven't already. And if you have, why not watch it again? It fucking rules.
And now I bid you farewell. Good evening.